Welcome back to Love Unveiled, the resilient relationship revolution. I'm Waqas Malik, a forgiveness coach, and today we have Jon-Paul, an army veteran, speaker, high performance coach, and lifelong learner, with us once more. Together, we explore the importance of generational healing and nurturing healthy family dynamics, learning how to create a better environment for your loved ones. Thanks, John Paul, for joining me today as well.
Waqas Malik, so good to be with you. I love our conversations.
Thank you. So, John, my first question is to you that why is it vital to recognize and address the impact of generational trauma on our family dynamics?
Yes, such an important question that the general population, general society knows so little about, but needs to know more about. So I'm so grateful to you for being willing to have this conversation and to educate your audience and mine. And I just hope it spreads. Think of this as a kind of a beginning conversation in this, because generational trauma, sometimes it's known as intergenerational trauma, is not an easy topic to discuss. So and it can be quite deep. So I'm going to hit the wave tops here, and maybe we can just step through this as a beginning for the audience. And I'll start this way. Would it surprise you to learn that trauma is all around us? You see people that have experienced trauma every day, and you probably see people that are living with unhealed trauma every day. And so if you can accept that trauma is all around you, it would make sense then to have a crash course, kind of a trauma 101 here, to cover the very basics, so that we kind of set a foundation before going into a discussion about generational trauma. But what I'm going to talk about now kind of sets that up. So if we listen to what the world's top medical and neuroscience experts tell us, we'll find clues about what trauma is, and they may help you start to recognize it a little bit more around you. I promise trauma is not something to fear. Trauma is actually something to pay attention to and to embrace and to find healing for. So let me share my screen and just start with the question, what is trauma? And one of my favorite thought leaders on this topic is Dr. Gabor Mate. And look what he says trauma is. He's one of the world's leading thought leaders on trauma and addiction. He says trauma is a wound. Trauma is a wound that leaves an imprint on your nervous system, and then it shows up in ways that aren't helpful in your relationships, in your career, in your parenting, socially with your friends you choose to spend time with. And so the stigma around trauma that society has would have you believe it's way more than that it's a disorder, which is what makes it scary. But I would suggest for the audience, just think going forward, think of trauma as a wound. And guess what? With the right treatment, you can heal a wound. And that's what kind of starts, that's what makes it a little less scary. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is another leader in the area of trauma treatment and the author of the best-selling book, The Body Keeps the Score. And he says that trauma is something that happens to you that makes you so upset that it overwhelms you. So here's another clue. The effects of trauma can be and often are overwhelming at the most inconvenient times. And it's always unhelpful. He gives us another clue about how to think of trauma. It's not about what happened, either directly to you or something you witnessed. It's how you're responding to that event right now, which is why talk therapy isn't helpful. It doesn't work when you're treating trauma. Let's look at one more thought leader on this topic. Peter Levine developed a body-based trauma treatment called somatic experiencing. This is the treatment that I received With my wife, we went together for sessions for over 3 years once I received my post-traumatic stress diagnosis. And look at what he says about it. Uh, Whatever skeletons might be hiding in your closet or secrets your family might be keeping, you now know that it's because there's an absence of an empathetic witness that understands that it's just a wound that's asking to be healed. When we get triggered, that's our trauma talking to us, saying, pay attention to me. I need your time and attention to heal. So there's no place for judgment here. Judgment and criticism is the last thing to apply when you're dealing with trauma. And that was an important lesson that I learned in my experience with somatic experiencing. When I started going, all I wanted to do is get rid of my trauma. But your body has a way of sensing that, what your intentions are. And if you go into healing trauma with an idea of getting rid of it, instead of seeing it, hearing it, recognizing it, and embracing it, your body is going to resist, and your healing journey will be made all the more hard, more challenging for you. And once I was able to understand that and just kind of let it unfold as I embraced it, the healing was able to begin. So let's take these three thought leaders and what they say about trauma and put it together and just answer this question: what is trauma? Well, first of all, it's a wound. It's a wound that's overpowering and overwhelming and held in place by a lack of empathy. And that means we can do something about it if we recognize these facts and respond differently to what's going on. Now, what causes trauma? It's anything that threatens your safety, your survival, or your dignity, whether real or perceived, or it happens to you directly or indirectly. You don't have to directly experience a traumatic event in order to be traumatized from what happened. And it doesn't always happen very quickly. Sometimes it happens over time, as is the case with neglect or abuse in the home as we're growing up. I classify trauma into three categories. Trauma happens as a result of abuse, neglect, or dysfunction in the home, in our workplaces, and in our communities and society. It's everywhere around us. Just switch on the TV and you'll get your daily dose of trauma-inducing events. And let me show you the things that keep trauma in place. Judgment, lack of empathy, lack of education, lack of awareness of what to look for. These are the symptoms, but let me go back to this slide because I think I'm behind a slide here. This is how I classify the causes of trauma: abuse, dysfunction, and other neglect as well. And these are some ways that these causes of trauma happen. So when we're talking about abuse, there is a whole range of ways that we can either experience abuse directly or secondhand. Same thing with neglect. If there's physical and emotional neglect, if you were a child that was often left alone when you were very young, that can be a very frightening experience that you internalize, that you begin forming beliefs around, that I'm not lovable, that I'm not good enough for some reason. Or dysfunction, if you experience mental illness in the home, if your mother was mistreated by your father or by another family member, if you experienced divorce in your childhood while you were growing up, or a family member spent time in prison, or addiction is a story within the history of your family, or you have eating disorders, for example. And then there's a raft of other causes of trauma that can affect the quality of our life. you see that this can happen to anyone, and any one of us can experience this. This is why I said earlier, trauma is all around us. We haven't been taught to recognize it. And so, what keeps trauma hidden in families? These are the things that keeps trauma in place. A lack of education, a lack of awareness of the signs of trauma in our own homes, in the workplace, in our society. It's all around us. We just haven't learned how to spot it. Stigma keeps it in place. It not only keeps the fear, the judgment, and the criticism about trauma in place, it keeps it hidden in the shadows. And that's what gives trauma its power of fear, really, to make us fearful of it. It's nothing to fear. And then, of course, blame. Whenever we blame someone else for the problems that they have or that they bring into the environment, we're keeping trauma in place. And so to break the cycle, we've got to be open to learning about trauma, take responsibility for how we feel, and replace judgment and criticism with empathy and compassion. Because remember, trauma is just a wound. Okay, now with that as kind of the backdrop, what is generational trauma? Well, I call it our first wound. It's our first wound after we're born, and it happens at a very, very young age when the unresolved emotional or psychological wounds that our parents have experienced influence how they raise us. And that has a profound implication on the family dynamics. Recent studies in neuroscience reveal that children that are exposed to generational trauma are more likely to experience adverse effects on their mental health and cognitive development. And it doesn't end with them. Research also suggests that these impacts can persist for many generations, affecting not only the individual, but also shaping the family dynamics. Studies also highlight that children from trauma-affected families often face enormous challenges in forming secure attachments, leading to difficulties in establishing healthy boundaries and successful relationships later on in life. Moreover, the neurobiological consequences of generational trauma can really get in the way of our personal growth, which hinders us from reaching our full potential. People who have a history of generational trauma may be at a higher risk for mental health disorders or creating a significant barrier to career and personal growth. And so these are some of the signs of possible presence of generational trauma. How many of these can you identify with? How many of these have you experienced? This is not a judgment. This is an attempt to just make you aware of how common this is and how we misunderstand or misinterpret these signs when they occur. I just want to emphasize to your audience that just because they may experience one or more of these, it doesn't mean that generational trauma is behind that behavior. But if it happens repeatedly, if it's a pattern in the family, in other words, that may be worth paying attention to. So recognizing the far-reaching effects of generational trauma is really, really crucial for developing approaches for breaking the cycle. We empower individuals and families to foster resilience, nurture healthy relationships, and unlock their full potential by bringing these deep-seated wounds into the light. It's not just about healing the past. It's about creating a foundation for a brighter future, both personally and professionally, that lead to healthier, stronger, more vibrant relationships with others.
Thanks for explaining in so much detail, and it's really helpful for me and for my audience as well as for me. as your audience. And so my next question is to you that what strategies can be employed to break the cycle and foster healthier family relationships?
Yeah, let's look at how generational trauma gets passed on. So here are some common strategies that families can use to disrupt the cycle of generational trauma and foster healthier relationships. So here in this slide, here's an example of grandparents that may have experienced these kinds of abuses or neglect or dysfunction within their family. You know, in North America, where I live in the United States, we are living in our country with a legacy of slavery in the past, and this is absolutely something that previous generations experienced, and the traumatic effects of being enslaved have been passed along from generation to generation simply because we have not fully understood the impacts of those experiences on ourselves. We're experiencing that very much now in Gaza and Ukraine and other parts of the world where war is happening or where people are being marginalized. This has an immense impact on people, and it gets passed down. So, in the context of this illustration, you know, our grandparents pass their experiences down to our parents, and it may show up in abusive or cruel behavior or domestic violence that our parents witnessed or experienced. It may be betrayals or infidelity or addictions, or other wounds. Maybe we get into unhealthy relationships or where we struggle with creating boundaries. This is what our parents may have experienced in their upbringing as a result of the kind of relationship they had with their grandparents and the psychological and emotional pain they experienced that they handed down. And keep in mind, this all happens subconsciously. We're not even aware that we're doing this. I mean, I love my daughter so much. I would never want to consciously pass down some of the things that I experienced while I was growing up. So this all happens subconsciously. We're not aware of it. And finally, as our parents, they pass to the next generation, which is our generation, yours and mine, our own experienced lived experiences that lead to that lead to the passing on of generational trauma. So what started in our grandparents, and it didn't just start with our grandparents, it started generations before them. It continuously got passed down from one generation to the next generation to the next generation, and it shows up in different ways to affect the quality of our life, our ability to adjust to our society, to form healthy relationships, to set boundaries and limitations, to define our self-worth, our self-esteem, and our confidence, our self-confidence in ourself. And that has a profound impact. And I'll get to this in just a bit, but there are some strategies that can help us break this cycle. And the two that really come to mind are therapeutic interventions. I shared with you 3 thought leaders, Gabor Mate, Bessel van der Kolk, and Peter Levine, that really promote therapeutic body-based interventions that help us start healing those generational wounds that have been passed down. But I think even before that, education and awareness can really, really go a long way to promoting awareness about the presence of generational trauma and how crucial it is to break that cycle and ways that we can break that cycle. And one of the key areas I believe that we must educate ourselves is how we normalize an event after it happens. And let me just talk a moment about that, because I view this as a key issue that we must raise awareness about. And you might have heard this term, normalizing or normalization. Normalizing simply means that when something traumatic happens, when an event happens, for example, when I was in a combat environment during the wars that I deployed to, I would see and experience things that were very, very emotionally overwhelming. I had to shut that part of myself down just to survive in that environment. So normalizing simply means that we suppress our emotions when we witness or experiencing a traumatizing event, so we can just keep functioning and survive whatever the situation is. There's only one reason really to normalize, and that's when our very survival is threatened. So if someone is a victim of sexual or domestic abuse, she or he must normalize in order to survive that situation when it happens. And again, when I deployed to a war zone, my nervous system was constantly scanning the environment for threats to my survival. I had to keep functioning to ensure my survival and the survival of my soldiers that I led. So, as horrible as it was to see something terrible, feeling it and processing it in that moment would have put my life in danger. So, I learned to suppress whatever my emotions were and just drive on, just continue the mission. This is what our brain is wired to do in any situation that's threatening. And we see that happening now in Gaza, in Ukraine, at the southern border of the United States, that it is having so many problems with people, with migrants coming into our country. It happens in the workplace too, where there is an abusive person that's in charge. And we often take that home with us and share that with our family. People must suppress their emotions around a traumatizing event just to survive. But I want to continue on this for just another moment. What no one talks about, and what no one certainly taught me in the military, is how to process those emotions after the event was over and I was in a safe place again. So why does this matter? And it's not just soldiers, it's not just members of the military that experience this. Go back to a situation of abuse or neglect or dysfunction in the home that you might have been a witness to or participant in or a victim of when you were growing up. You have to normalize to survive, but no one teaches us how to process those emotions after the event's over and we're in a safe place again, because our long-term happiness and our ability to perform at our highest levels depend on how well we've been able to heal our past experiences. That's the inherent danger that comes as part of normalizing or normalization. It feels like we're managing ourselves emotionally because we're able to suppress the emotion so we can continue to function in a threatening environment. And that sounds really inviting. If I can manage my emotions, I don't need any treatment. I don't need to talk to anybody else. I've got life under control. But what we don't see is that our nervous system is still on a heightened state of alert. It's still holding on to that experience. And when that happens, our brain releases adrenaline into our body to help us cope with that situation where we once felt threatened. But if the threat no longer exists and that adrenaline is still there, that's not good. Chemicals like adrenaline and dopamine and cortisol, they're intended only for short bursts. But if we get too much of that and it stays in our system for too long, it can seriously harm our health. So the more you know, the less you'll find there is to fear about trauma, and the better motivated you'll be to do this vital work. Awareness is key, along with having the courage to bring it into the light. So suppose something doesn't seem right in your family. In other words, if there's abuse or neglect or dysfunction, these may be signs that generational trauma could be playing a role. So I would encourage you to reflect on your family history without judging it. Look, believe it or not, most families are dealing with this. It's just that most families keep it hidden because there's shame attached to that history, to those experiences. But we've got to be willing to turn toward the shame and embrace it and look at it and see it to understand it. That those might be signs that generational trauma could be playing a role. So as you reflect on your family history, ask yourself, have similar problems existed in the generation that came before yours? And while there certainly should be accountability in cases of abuse and neglect, we can see them as indicators of the possible presence of generational trauma that hasn't been healed. So I'm a huge advocate of awareness and education and the availability of therapeutic interventions, which is why I'm so glad you're doing this episode. It's so vital to understand the basics of this. But, other strategies like open communication and the creation of support networks that helps cultivate resilience are also very effective. And the more willing we are to bring generational and intergenerational trauma into the light, the easier it will become to treat it properly and heal at an individual, family, and community level. And I truly believe that effective and empathetic treatment of trauma in all its forms can change the world if we can just wrap our heads around the idea that everybody goes through this. It's not unique to our family. And if we can see it that way, maybe we can be a little bit more accepting of things, a little less judgmental, a little bit more empathetic and curious and compassionate and interested in finding a solution.
Thanks for such a comprehensive answer. So my next question is very important, and that is, how can we empower the next generation to create nurturing family environments and address their emotional needs?
So important, so important. Well, I would say to create nurturing family environments for the next generation, it's really, really imperative to instill emotional intelligence and well-being practices very, very early on. Research such as the longitudinal study published in the Journal of Marriage and Family suggests that children exposed to emotionally supportive family environments demonstrate greater resilience and enhanced long-term mental health outcomes. And by fostering open communication and validating a child's emotional experiences, we're really laying the foundation for healthier relationships and emotional well-being. But society has got to confront the stigmas surrounding mental health to empower the next generation, really, to empower them truly. A report by the World Health Organization emphasizes the importance of overcoming societal biases that often marginalize mental health concerns. So by challenging the misconception that mental fitness is a sign of weakness, we pave the way for proactive approaches to emotional well-being. But also we pave the way for taking the fear out of looking at unhealed trauma and getting more interested in it, normalizing discussions around mental health and integrating mental fitness into our healthcare practices, just like we do for our physical fitness. Tending to our mental fitness can really, really shift how our society views and the attitude that it forms around encouraging families to prioritize the emotional needs of our children. And schools can really help too in playing this pivotal role to create this paradigm shift. Because the younger we are when we learn these basic concepts, the faster we'll be able to create change. Research in the Journal of School Health indicates that comprehensive mental health education in schools contributes to increased awareness and reduced stigma. So incorporating well-being practices into a curriculum, when we do that, we equip the next generation with the knowledge and the skills to navigate their emotions and cultivate a nurturing family and social environment. It's really, really time to redefine mental fitness as an integral part of overall health. And I know that you do that as a forgiveness coach. I do that as well. And there are really three ways to do that very quickly. First is engaging in mindfulness practices. It's really a powerful way for young adults to incorporate mental fitness into their routines. Another mental fitness routine is doing just a regular emotional check-in. Cultivating social influence early on is really vital to building strong mental fitness. And I would encourage young adults to incorporate regular emotional check-ins into their routines and honor how you feel at any given moment. And the third practice young adults can adopt is establishing healthy boundaries. When you develop and maintain healthy boundaries around what's acceptable to you and support the life that you want to build, you take a massive step toward good mental fitness. Of course, this can be a challenge in a family environment where the boundaries are not healthy or not clear. But this is when you can look to a mentor or a support system outside of the family to help you develop that. So essential. So by integrating mindfulness practices, regular emotional check-ins, and the establishment of healthy boundaries, we can really proactively enhance our mental fitness. It's not a cure for generational trauma. Again, seeking treatment from a trained trauma treatment professional may still be necessary, but just imagine approaching it with a healthy, fit mindset, mental mindset that sees value in healing and building a life with more aliveness and deeper connections. These habits contribute to our overall well-being and really lay the groundwork for more fulfilling relationships and family dynamics that embrace self-care and mental fitness as ingredients to their happiness.
Amazing. So, in what ways can we rebuild trust and connection within our families?
Yeah, well, the truth is, generational trauma can really cast a long shadow over family dynamics. Whenever there's a history of abuse or neglect or dysfunction, that really affects our ability to trust and connect with other members of our family, because in healthy ways, because the symptoms of generational trauma are really often difficult to recognize. I believe because of a lack of awareness of the signs to look for. For example, I'm not ashamed to talk about my own example of generational trauma in my family as a way to kind of contextualize this. My parents were children during World War II. They experienced it firsthand as children. My father was a young boy in the Netherlands growing up. He saw the German occupation of Holland during World War II and some of the atrocities that happened there. My mother was a young girl growing up in Indonesia, which was a colony of Holland at the time, and she spent the formative years of her childhood in a Japanese concentration camp. And those experiences as children had a profound effect on their life. I could not recognize as a young boy the rage in my parents or the passive aggressiveness that one of my parents demonstrated as symptoms of generational trauma that was being passed down to me. I just had no way of recognizing it, which is why awareness education is so important. It just takes one member of a family to take proactive steps toward healing to stop the cycle of generational trauma and bring about transformative change. You know, I knew that something was not right in my childhood as I was growing up. I knew that my parents had suffered tremendously as children. I didn't connect the dots from that suffering to the way it was manifesting when they became adults as their son. But I sure did know that something was not right. And if I did not take the proactive steps on my own to try to understand it in a different context, and then learn there is healing work to do, we may not be having this conversation. That unfortunately, that's how we break the cycle of generational trauma today. It's done often very quietly by one member of the family that just understands, they just intuitively know, they sense something's not right, and I've got to do something to break this cycle.
Right. So, can we see a future of healthier, more fulfilling family relationships for ourselves and for our children?
I believe it's absolutely possible. It's absolutely within our reach if we're willing to do the work. It really requires a collaborative effort involving us as individuals, but also our families, our community leaders, and religious leaders to eliminate the stigmas around unresolved trauma and foster a more compassionate approach to mental health fitness. You know, for a lot of people that are in leadership positions, this can be a scary proposition because they may very well have experienced generational trauma in their family history, but they're too ashamed, they're too embarrassed to talk about it. But it's just essential to breaking that cycle. So, on an individual level, self awareness is really, really crucial, as is developing emotional intelligence. I call it social intelligence. I called it that earlier. It's the same thing. It's a personal responsibility to take an interest in our mental well-being and understand and manage our emotions appropriately. It's a personal responsibility to develop a more expansive vocabulary around our emotions as we understand and relate to our emotions better, and to recognize that every situation has a corresponding, I'm sorry, every emotion has a corresponding sensation in our body. This is how our body talks to us to alert us when something isn't right and tells us when it's healthy and vibrant. You know, when we laugh, we can feel it in our body. That's a sign that our body is healthy, that it's well, and that we're headed in the right direction in our life. But we also ought to be able to recognize when our body is sad and feeling isolated or feeling threatened, and understand what that means, get curious about it, and start taking the next right acts of integrity to address it. And as forgiveness coaches, we understand how vital it is to learn the language of our emotions. It's the only way to collectively contribute to a more empathetic, compassionate, resilient family unit. And speaking of families, they play a central role in the journey toward healthier relationships too. You know, effective communication among family members, active listening, taking an interest in what we're achieving individually and as a family, and expressing feelings should be prioritized and emphasized within the family structure. Establishing positive family rituals and intentional connections, whether through shared experiences or collaborative activities that we do together, really helps to foster a culture of trust and support and joy that helps us develop our emotional intelligence and social influence skills. Families are really, really the primary agents in instilling values and modeling healthy relationship dynamics for future generations. And for families who are struggling because there's generational trauma and there are wounds there is help available. You can heal this and start to experience higher levels of satisfaction and joy and happiness more often than the opposite of anxiety and depression and hypervigilance that often comes as a result of the presence of generational trauma. But it doesn't just stop there at the individual and family level. Community and political leaders, I believe, also have a vital role to play. They have access to the resources that are needed to create conditions within the community and regionally and nationally and even globally that promote mental fitness and well-being. It simply must be a priority in government to invest more in this area. Integrating comprehensive mental health education into our schools and community programs helps to equip us, especially younger generations, with knowledge, skills, and ability to recognize, properly interpret, and then navigate their emotions and build resilient relationships. These leaders can also help develop support networks and resources for individuals and families affected by generational trauma. This is much, much needed. It's a much needed long-term investment that will create a future and a culture where seeking help is as normal as going shopping. And finally, I would also suggest that religious and faith leaders play a vital role in shaping cultural norms and values. Teachings that emphasize incorporating empathy, forgiveness, love, and emotional well-being into our daily living over criticism, judgment, and condemnation contribute to a culture of compassion and understanding within individuals, families, and communities, which in turn encourages communities to create supportive spaces for individuals and families to share their experiences, seek guidance, and find understanding and acceptance. Maybe that sounds a little idealistic. I know that it isn't easy, but we are where we are today as a global community, because I know you experience this just as much in Pakistan as I do in America. We're here today as a global community because we have resisted making mental health, fitness, and well-being a global priority. Creating a world that reduces the effects of all forms of trauma, starting with generational trauma and promoting healthier family relationships, requires a collective commitment. Individuals, families, community leaders, and political and religious leaders each have unique roles and responsibilities in this process. And I, for one, am convinced that by working together, we can build a future where emotional well-being is prioritized, generational cycles of trauma are broken, and families experience the fulfillment of meaningful and resilient relationships, and we can transform the world together, just like you and I are doing in this series, brother.
Thank you for joining us today. Remember, breaking the cycle of generational trauma is the key to building stronger family relationships. Join us in the next episode as we continue our journey toward resilient, thriving relationships. Thanks, Jon-Paul.
Thank you.